Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. Here, we aim to bring you the experience, strength, and hope of professionals working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. Our mission is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a recognized disorder. Here, we discuss all things recovery, exploring the many pathways people take towards abstinence in order to achieve a health-forward lifestyle. We hope to inspire you to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, and share your journey with others. And hopefully the message will spread.
Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your host today, speaking with Dr. Rachel Herz, PhD. Dr. Herz is a neuroscientist and a leading expert on the psychology of smell and how scent shapes taste, food, and behavior. She is a TED 2019 and TEDx 2024 speaker. She's published 108 peer-reviewed research articles. Dr. Herz is faculty on Brown University and is frequently called upon as an expert witness in legal cases involving smell. She is the incoming president of the International Society of Neurogastronomy. Her books include the widely used textbook Sensation and Perception, and That's Disgusting, Unveiling the Mysteries of Repulsion, which was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. And finally, Why You Eat What You Eat, The Science Behind Our Relationship with Food, named among the best food books of 2018 by Smithsonian and The New Yorker. We at Food Junkies are particularly interested in how our relationship to foods, particularly disgustive foods, can influence our eating behaviors. Might this information help those of us with disordered eating patterns? Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Vera. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
So what got you into the area of disgust in the first place and neurogastronomy overall?
As you mentioned, my research expertise is primarily in the sense of smell. And one of the really interesting things about smell is it's highly modulated by context. So the scene, the interpretation that we have when we encounter an odor really alters our perception of that scent. And also that it's really based on learning. There are not innate responses to vanilla or cardamom or whatever the case might be. So there are certain qualifications to that statement having to do with olfactory receptors and what particular versions of them you have expressed. But apart from that, our liking or disliking comes from how we've learned to experience the scent and how a culture has also affected us with respect to that. And what I found super interesting about the emotion of disgust is it's really a parallel to that. The emotion of disgust is primarily learned. We don't have newborns, for example, play with poop. And young kids, they'll pick up a dead bird and look, mommy, look what I just found, and don't have an understanding that this is disgusting, this could be contaminated, this could be bad for you, and so on, and actually have to learn that. And particularly in the context of food, what one culture considers disgusting, another culture could consider delicious. And there's nothing about the macronutrients involved in that determine disgust or deliciousness. It has to do with the cultural meaning of the food and other aspects of it that are related to the culture. So because disgust and scent have so many of these parallels related to context, culture, and learning, I found it a particularly interesting emotion to research.
I was taught in medical school that smell is the quickest and most accurate or surest way to get to the amygdala. Like it's almost instinctual, so primal.
Right. And actually, you're connecting two things which I think are really interesting. One is the neuroanatomy. So the primary olfactory cortex, where the conscious perception of scent takes place, is the conjoined regions of the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala is also fully involved in another job, and that is processing emotion. The hippocampus is also doing something else as well, which is connecting learning and memory and various other forms of spatial organization and so forth. The fact that where our conscious perception of scent takes place is those two regions is why smell is so inherently emotional, why we have more or less an instantaneous emotional response. Now, the caveat to liking or disliking is when we've never smelled something before, but here too, there's this kind of cautiousness, that kind of built-in neophobia, where we don't want to go leaping onto something we don't know anything about. So again, there's a kind of a built-in approach avoid when we connect with a scent. And that is fundamentally scaffolded on the parts of the brain that are doing the processing of smell, as well as the other things like emotion and learning.
We're going to pick up more on this. Could you tell us a little bit about your books?
Sure. So again, I'll tell you the idea to get into the reason why I wrote the book of That's Disgusting. So after I did my first book, The Scent of Desire, which is all about the sense of smell, I got asked to be a judge for the National Rotten Sneakers Contest. And this doesn't continue to go on, unfortunately. The pandemic really kind of did it in. It was a big public event that first started off actually in Montpelier, Vermont. It's in the Farmer's Almanac, kind of as something that's gone on for quite a number of years there. I think at least 30 years or so before I got involved. It then got picked up by some commercial entities that were interested in like foot odor and things like that. And because of sneakers, obviously you see the connection. And the person that approached me was very persuasive, and she said, "You get to have this all paid for weekend in Stowe, Vermont, and stay at this great resort, and it's really fun, and it's kids, and it's this and it's that." So she was very persuasive, and I said yes. In the interim between my saying yes and when the contest was, I would tell people about this, and they're like, "You've got to be kidding me. You're going to stick your nose in teenagers' sneakers? Are you insane? This is going to be so disgusting." And I started really thinking about it and pondering what I had gotten myself into and getting worried about what was going to happen and that I was going to be able to handle that this was going to be like really highly unpleasant. And when I actually got to the contest, I had spent all this time sort of thinking about it, building it up, worrying about it, and so forth. And I'm by no way saying that these sneakers smelled like roses. They were bad. But my psychological and sort of preemptive mental effort and things that I had imagined it would be like, it was actually far less bad than it was. And I realized how much thinking, literally thinking, the thinking process was involved in our perception of disgust and how it's all relative and how we construe it and so forth. And this got me really thinking that this was an emotion that, as I said, has these parallels to the sense of smell and was actually something really interesting to explore, how the person themselves brings their person and background and everything else to this particular emotion. It was the lead in from disgust to the connection to what I had done previously. And as I also mentioned, disgust is really involved in our experience of food and delicious, disgusting, and so forth, culture, personal learning, etc. And the fact that also research on the sense of smell is obviously I've done research on taste and flavor and so on. And so it seemed like a very natural connection to then bring this into studying food and our relationship to food and our eating behavior.
In That's Disgusting, you argue that disgust was evolved to primarily help us avoid contamination and disease, like specifically rotting food. So tell us then how the disgust response actually works.
Something that's really fascinating to me about disgust and taste and food and so forth. And that is that, and since we're on YouTube, I can make this face and people will see it. The face that you make if you taste something extremely bitter, super quinine, or if you're a super taster like raw endive or something like that. And the face that you make, if I say, I want you to hold your stranger neighbor's dirty dentures in your hands after they've just come out of their mouth, is this ick face that is actually the same. And the ick face is either like that, which is closing off. I'm sorry, I'm smiling right now, so I'm not completely getting it. Or the sticking your tongue out. Both of those faces actually have very important survival features to them. The closed off like this, you're also closing down your eyes, you're closing off your nose a little bit too. It's keep whatever is out there nowhere near getting into me. That's like a protective, I'm not going to consume this, I'm not going to get it into my body because it's going to be bad. That kind of sticking your tongue out face is I've got something in there, I want to get it out. So whatever it is, I'm not going to swallow it because it could be hazardous and so forth. So it's either the getting out or the closing off. And like I said, this has very important survival characteristics, and bitter taste is the origin of this facial expression. And taste of bitter is actually innate. And in nature, except for some healthy leafy greens, almost everything else that tastes bitter is actually poisonous. So it's very good that we do not want to swallow things that elicit this reaction. And the reason why bitter is so aversive, and we also have more receptors for bitter than we have for any other taste sensation, to make sure that we don't accidentally swallow something bitter because of its potential serious toxicity. So this is a real survival-based response, which is then the basis for this emotion, which is much more cognitively complex and takes with it this sort of origin of rejecting things that are bitter tasting, could be poison, to thinking about things that we don't want to incorporate into us and we want to get out of us, which are very complex.
The image that I got was when somebody sneezes in your face, and it's the same reaction of, ugh, and you want to close, exactly, because you don't want those germs to go into you. Makes sense.
So the origins are in taste and the get out the poison. But
Yeah.
exactly, the next step in terms of the avoidance from a survival perspective is contamination, specifically avoiding disease. So someone coughing on you, sneezing on you, etc. I want to get away from that because of the fact this is someone spreading their bad germs on me. Even if I just caught something in my throat, you may not know that. Better to be safe than sorry. However, this is something that you've learned. The only part of disgust that you haven't learned is that get that bitter thing out of my mouth. But when you were a little kid and someone like sneezed on you, before you might have thought, ooh, I'm wet, but you wouldn't have been thinking, oh no, this person is sick and I'm going to get sick. That's actually something that we've had to learn. And all the other levels of disgust, representationally, bodily fluids, people's behavior, which is also an aspect of things that we find disgusting, and so forth, sexual quote unquote deviance, these things that are repulsive to us are based on having learned the meaning of them and that they represent this kind of deviance, which could be contaminating and also dangerous. Because the other thing that's so interesting about the emotion of disgust, all of our emotions are there to help keep us alive. Most of our other emotions respond to things that are very much in the moment, like fear. There's a tiger about to leap on top of you. You don't even want to, you don't think about it. You're just going to escape. There's some really positive thing happening. You're just going to smile and try to go towards it. Disgust actually requires thinking about the fact, and even if you haven't consciously registered it, that if this thing gets into me, I'm not going to necessarily drop dead in the instant. It could take days or weeks for me to get sick. It could take however long also for the fact that I swallowed this poison for me to actually succumb to it. So there's a very slow contingency connected to the emotion of disgust, which is not involved in our other emotional experiences. And because of that, it requires this more elaborated cognitive scaffolding and thinking, and also learning directly that don't do this because it's going to lead to that, rather than having to learn the hard way.
So in terms of taste, the only thing that warns us of danger is the bitter taste. Anything else that we have discussed is learned.
Correct.
But when I think about eating insects, I feel repulsed by that. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so that's completely cultural. So there are many Asian, South Asian cultures, as well as South American cultures, where insect eating is actually not only something that's done, it's actually something that's good that's done. And there are all kinds of food preparations for it that make it delectable and so forth. And the best example I can give to this that people can relate to is the idea of eating lobsters. So lobsters are actually gigantic insects that live in the water. Okay. So if you start thinking about that, you're probably not going to want to eat lobster. But when lobsters were first in North America, they like washed up on the shores in New England everywhere. They were literally vermin of the sea. Nobody wanted to go near them because they're like these strange aquatic insects, literally, which is what they are. And they were only fed to slaves and prisoners, to the point where there was actually a revolt against eating them because it was considered cruel and unusual punishment. Today, eating lobsters are a delicacy, they're expensive, people revere them and so on. Very few people, except if you get this head into your head of them being giant floating insects, consider them disgusting. In fact, they consider them to be the opposite of disgusting. So this is exactly the same thing the idea of eating land insects is just as psychologically determined. And if you, for instance, one of the things that you can do to make the idea less salient and bad is if you, for instance, crushed up a whole bunch of crickets and made flour out of it, use that flour to, for instance, make a cookie, and then ate the cookie that didn't look at all like it had any insect parts to it whatsoever, and in and of itself just tasted like a good cookie. This is sort of like a stepping stone to be able to then accept what this was actually made with cricket flour. And the good thing about cricket flour is it's high in protein, there's very low fat, it has all kinds of good things for you. So you can really get over this psychological hurdle by reconstruing, first of all, the idea of it as being good for you, and secondly, hiding it. So I'm not looking at these wriggly things that I've just fried up for you. But then potentially one day you can get to that. And if you do eat it, surprise, it just tastes like crunchy, salty, tasty, like a potato chip. I've actually done this, but the trick is actually really getting it into your head as being something positive and being something that you're willing to explore, rather than saying, oh my God, no way, gross insects, I would never eat them.
What about like feces? Children don't mind feces, but we as adults do mind feces. And is that because it's just learned? Would we otherwise not care?
Yes, we would not care. There are a lot of cultural examples where, for example, the modern sewer system is not available, and bodily fluids, feces, human waste, etc., is much more prevalent. Not that we have learned, and this is a good thing, that diseases, and all cultures have taken on to understand this, that diseases can be transmitted through fecal matter. So that's actually, we have learned that. But from the point of view of the degree to which we want to hide it, get rid of it, consider it absolutely abhorrent, there are many levels of that have to do with cultural experience and cultural sort of dictates about civilization, hiding private behavior, and so forth, that are highly variable across different cultures. And so people respond to them differently as a function of that. And before you learned or were taught in some way or other that there's a disease contamination component about something that comes out of your body, there's no reason to say something that comes out of my body is gross.
So
And I want to take this a little further, even the idea of something that comes out of your body that then going back into your body is awful. And a really good example of this is actually saliva. So you have saliva in your mouth right now. I'm just going to ask you, is it bothering you?
Not at all.
Okay. So if I were to say, now I want you to spit into a glass and then I want you to drink what's in that glass.
Yeah, it sounds gross.
Right. And if you do it and if you see it, you're also very repulsed. But literally 3 seconds ago, that was in your mouth. Nothing has changed. It got some air. That's about it. You could get that same air if you opened your mouth and breathed in. But suddenly something that was on the inside of us went to the outside, and then I'm asking you to bring it back in. And this something is a certain type of bodily fluid. And it's interesting to me, for instance, that saliva becomes repulsive in this sort of internal to external, but tears do not. Tears are actually very interesting, and it can be tears of joy, tears of sadness, tears because you're chopping an onion, but tears seem to be, I would say, an exception to the something that was in me that went out, and now I'm not repulsed by it. And maybe because it's the eyes, maybe because it also is already a little bit on the outside, because it's not like tears came from back here and then had to get out some way. So I think that there's some interesting things, but I think also the emotional connotation, even when it's just from chopping onions, and because of its relationship, especially to sadness, which is an emotion that generally elicits empathy and sympathy and wanting to help, that may be a reason why fundamentally we don't have this went from the outside to the inside. We also don't learn that there's anything wrong with tears. We do learn there's things wrong with spit and urine and sweat and feces. And interesting, blood is another very interesting thing. Again, I think really demonstrating the learning component here. Menstrual blood is considered disgusting, and there's a long history of misogynist and also a whole variety of related concepts to that women's blood from the uterus is bad, but if I cut my arm, there's people that may have phobias to that. I don't want to see blood. I don't like injections and so forth, but it doesn't have the same disgust connotation as for many people, especially men. Menstrual blood has this really negative disgust connotation, which is totally learned. Does not need to be like that at all.
You talk in the book that really illustrates the learned aversion is like with kissing. Now you've got somebody else's saliva in your mouth. That would be disgusting, except in that context, it's not.
Exactly.
And then it begs the question of some of the sexual perversions where other bodily fluids are included, and they're not disgusting in that context to those people. So really, most of our disgust is learned, you're saying.
I would say all of it other than bitter taste.
Other than bitter taste. How do people start with food avoidances? And that might be from children with the ARFID, food avoidance. Or can you comment on that? How do we develop that?
Typically, I mean, there is a developmental sort of potential bad period of time for children who may become extremely picky eaters, and this seems to be actually related to other emotional states that are going on at the same time. Obsessive compulsive disorder is highly connected to getting this extreme picky eating. So is anxiety. There could be family dynamics that are also involved that bring on a child's refusal to eat a variety of different kinds of foods. But typically, something that happens, I would say, pretty much to, I would assume, almost all of us, is that we've had an experience where we are eating something that we've eaten before and we haven't had a problem with. And then coincidentally in time, we get some kind of stomach aversion bug or something where we end up being sick in the toilet for some period of time after having consumed that food. And then we make the connection, because it was the last thing that we ate, that the reason why I'm suddenly sick is because of the food that I ate. Now, sometimes it could be true. Sometimes you could have gotten food poisoning from that food. That's normally fine. And in this case, became contaminated. Or you did actually eat something you shouldn't eat, that pretty red berry that actually we should stay away from. Or it actually has nothing to do with it, but because of the fact that it was the last thing that we consumed, we make this connection, and that connection is extremely difficult to break out of. Now, the reason why it's extremely difficult to break out of it is actually because you don't want to be eating that pretty red berry again, because it is going to make you sick. So we have this built-in one trial aversion learning. If after I ate whatever it was, I got sick, regardless of the reason why, it's extremely hard to get me to go back to consuming that again. Even if I can tell myself rationally, I know that I was with so-and-so who had a stomach bug, and just because I also ate a pepperoni pizza that day, it wasn't the pepperoni pizza that made me sick. It's because I got Susie's stomach bug. Doesn't matter. I don't want pepperoni pizza again. And the critical thing is actually the aroma of the pepperoni pizza, and seeing the full pepperoni pizza is what is doing it to me in terms of the aversion. The taste of salt, for example, and the reason I'm making a point is that this is typically referred to as a learned taste aversion, but taste is actually a very simple sensory system. It's salt, sour, sweet, and bitter. It's the aroma of the pepperoni and seeing this pepperoni pizza that is what is making you feel repulsed by it, not the taste of salt. That was the taste component of what you ate.
One trial aversion, that's all it might take if you had an extreme reaction. That child, something may have happened in his or her environment, one trial, and now they don't eat that food anymore.
That's if sickness is the cause. If it's like this developing of this very picky eating, that's something else. That typically does not have, it can have an origin where they did eat something that made them sick and then they generalized all things that are like that. However, it's much more likely that it's connected to other things that are going on in the child's life and emotionally that then make food for a child that has ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, like extreme picky eating. Food is frightening. It's not necessarily even disgusting. It's terrifying. And so this fear aspect of it is really more of the driver than the disgust aspect. When we've had an episode of vomiting and so forth after eating a food, and now we've decided that food is bad, that food actually elicits the disgust response, not a fear response. So there's a different emotional mechanism involved.
Now I'm thinking about people in my community who avoid foods because they're afraid of something that's happened in the past. They've eaten foods that are sweet or highly processed and very palatable, but now they've had something negative happen, like a binge, and now they've become fearful. So it's basically a constructed psychological response, this disgust that's happened.
What you just said actually is interesting, because if I were to take that apart, it's not actually disgust, it's fear. I know that this food is a trigger for me to overconsume. I'm going to do that. I may then later feel disgusted with myself because I succumb to that, and the binge eating, I feel disgusted that I've done that. I'm a pig. I'm this, all the sort of negative thinking that connects to that for that person. But the food isn't necessarily disgusting. The food is, oh no, it's a trigger for me. I can't resist. I have real difficulty with this food and so on. And I need to stay away from it because I'm afraid of what I might do when I contact it or come into contact with it.
Yes, I would agree with you. It is actually more fear than disgust. Even though there's disgust involved in themselves, that's not the driver. Yeah, I get that. You talk about the spectrum of people being highly disgust sensitive versus those who aren't. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. And again, something I find fascinating about disgust. I explained that there's these different levels of cognitive interpretation that are required, starting off with the bitter taste, which you don't need any. It's just bitter tastes bad. We're built for that, to reject poison. And then you get to the most high complex level of disgust, which is moral disgust. And moral disgust, I've argued, and I've also done some research to support this, is, in my interpretation, not really disgust. It's really anger. But it's anger that also says, get away from me. I don't want to have anything to do with the people that act like that behave like that. And and because we've used the word disgust, like the behavior of that individual is disgusting and they've done something morally wrong, the use of the word disgust actually activates a feeling of revulsion in us, which then recodes the feeling as being something that makes me feel sick. So if I hadn't used the word disgust, if I'd said, that makes me so angry that person did that, I wouldn't feel the same way physically as I do if I said, that person is disgusting that they did that. So using the word disgust, it creates this embodied sensation because the word disgust is connected to feeling viscerally, physically ill in the sort of stomach, gastric kind of way, that using that word actually triggers a sort of conditioned response that changes the meaning and our response to the individual or what they've done to being disgusting. Now, the way I've actually demonstrated the relationship between moral disgust is being truly anchored in anger, whereas things like someone sneezing on top of you or holding somebody's dirty dentures or stepping on worms with bare feet or coming across somebody's feces in a toilet, all those kinds of things. I can go on, but I won't go on. The difference between those disgusts and the moral disgust, I demonstrated by examining taste sensitivity. And this is genetic, and this is you're born with this, and it doesn't actually have anything to do with anything. People are either what are referred to as super tasters or non-tasters. And this has to do with the number of taste buds you actually have in your mouth that vary if you're a non-taster from about 5,000 to if you're a super taster about 10,000, so literally double. And it makes everything that you taste stronger, more intense. So salty is stronger, sweet is stronger, creamy is more creamy, and so forth. And in particular, bitter is way more bitter if you're a super taster. And there's a very easy test that was used as an assay for being a super taster, which just looks at bitter taste responsivity. And it's to a particular chemical compound that if you're a non-taster, you don't perceive it. If you're a taster, you can perceive it as bitter, but it's not the most awful thing you've ever had in your mouth. And if you're a super taster, it is absolutely horrible. And this is based on genetics. So your genetic ability to respond to this particular compound, which is then correlated to the number of taste buds you have and being one of these three types of tasters. So what I looked at was people, whether or not they were a taster, a super taster, or a non-taster, based on this taste assay by using this particular compound, and then looked at their sensitivity to different kinds of disgust, either physical types of disgust that I've already gone through, I won't list again, or moral types of disgust. And what I found was that people who were super tasters were more emotionally disgusted by all those visceral physical things, but they were not more disgusted by moral things than any of the other types of tasters. So, in other words, being extra sensitive to bitter and taste in general, so the scaffolding upon which the emotion of disgust is built, does not make you more sensitive to moral transgression. It does make you more sensitive to these physical, emotional disgust transgressions, and that's related. So, why taste is not correlated with anger and other emotions, it is, though, connected to disgust, and that's what shows the bifurcation there.
Would you explain why in our community some people struggle more with eating than others because they are super tasters? They respond more to the foods just because they have more taste buds?
It could be that, or it could be the opposite, especially because what you're dealing with is psychological. So people who actually are non-tasters tend to eat more because they don't get the same, for instance, creaminess. So the ice cream is not as creamy, so they want more ice cream to get more creaminess, whereas a super taster would be like, this is really creamy, I'm getting my hit, I don't need to consume more. And same with sweet, same with salty, the potato chip, and so on. So non-tasters actually are more likely to be overweight than super tasters just in general because they have fewer barriers to consumption and they potentially want more to get their dose, as it were. And because what we're dealing with is people who are afraid of eating too much, it is possible that the people who you deal with who are not tasters are more afraid because they know once they get going, they're really going to get to the bottom of the cookie jar or the potato chips or the ice cream tub because they actually want more to get that sensation that they're craving.
That actually makes a lot of sense. When we talk about food addiction, you do acknowledge that there's a reward pathway and that particularly ultra processed foods are engineered to make foods very highly palatable. So where do you stand on our relationship with food addiction?
So the interesting thing about the reward pathway and all of that is it actually has to do with the physiological state of hunger and need. And so if you're in a physiological state of hunger and need and you consume something, that becomes reinforced and rewarded. And that pathway to, I want to do that again because when I did it at one time, I needed it, that becomes a sort of reinforced sort of connection. But it's not at all the same as, so where I differ in terms of the addiction. So I do think people can abuse food. I think there can be bad habits with respect to food where we've short-circuited paying attention to our bodies, paying attention to how we really feel when we eat something or really if we want to eat something. And all of those kinds of things absolutely believe that can get malfunctioning and lead to disordered eating behavior, and that needs to be addressed. However, in the concept of addiction, you have a state where I actually am seeking something that if I don't get it, I'm going to go into a state of negative physiological consequences. And that is absolutely not the case with food. So we actually have to eat. We need to eat at least once a day, if not more, depending upon how many calories we need in order to survive. With other things that people are addicted to, like drugs or alcohol or whatever other substances, this state has been created as a function of partaking in the act of, let's say, smoking cigarettes or whatever, this nicotine. Now I need that nicotine in order to feel okay because now I've developed a dependency on that. But it is not, and it may feel awful if I'm not having it, but this is not something which is built into me that I need to do in order to survive because I need that energy from, I don't need the energy from the cigarette. I may want the sensation that the nicotine gives me, and I've learned that as a positive. And there's also, though, something else which happens along the way with addiction, and that is a wanting versus a needing switch. So it goes from I want that feeling of being high or whatever the case might be to now I need it because if I don't get it, I feel bad. And that is actually, and I could feel bad in all kinds of different levels. And it could be like really bad. I could be sweating and vomiting and all kinds of other things because my body now needs this chemical that I've been feeding it to maintain normalcy, but it didn't need it to start with. It's just I've introduced something which has changed the balancing act of the compounds that keep me feeling normal. And if I don't have it, all kinds of dysregulation starts to happen until I can recalibrate down to not having it in my system. It's a completely different mechanism with food, which we actually have to have. We need calories. We need calories every single day. And the question is just, where are we getting those calories from? And is the source of those calories healthy? And you can also, people who can consume a lot of calories can feel bad gastrically because I have an upset stomach because all I just ate was a lot of ultra processed food, as you made a point about, and that the macronutrients, I haven't really gotten good macronutrients. I'm not actually doing something that's good for my body, but maybe I'm not even paying attention to my body anymore, and I'm just eating this out of habit, or I'm eating it out of the fact that it feels good in my mouth. What you said about engineering from the point of view of high palatability is maximizing the sort of equation of salt, sugar, fat that we are built hardwired to want to need, because we need those macronutrients to actually physically survive. So salt is actually a macronutrient that's indicative of protein, generally speaking, in nature. Fat is actually the best caloric bang for our buck. It's the most dense caloric substances that we can have. And again, we evolved in a state of scarcity, not a landscape of abundance. And it's also, we need fat from the point of view of our brains and our muscles and everything else. We need to consume fat. We don't make that fat. And sugar, sweetness, which is carbohydrates, are the easiest convertible form of energy. So if I want energy to be able to go hunt, to get the protein, to get the fat and so forth, I need those carbohydrates. I need that sweet taste. All of that we have to have. Now, when I'm a food manufacturer and I'm trying to get you to buy my product, I know that salt, sugar, and fat are like key inherent ingredients, and I can figure out how to make a food taste really good with the right combinations of all those things that, yes, when I have whatever it is in my mouth, does produce a lot of pleasure. But maybe after I've eaten a certain amount of it, my stomach doesn't feel so good, or I feel really tired, or I feel then the cascade of negative, self-reproachful guilt, emotions, shame, etc., that could happen because I yielded to the temptation and so forth. So there's a whole lot of other things going on with that, but food itself is not addictive. We have to consume it.
I'm thinking about ultra processed food. Is it possible that there be a bitterness to something, but that the enhancement of the sugar, salt, fat can fool the body, fool our taste sensors?
Yes, you could actually have something which starts off bitter, or there's a bitter component, and the different chemicals that go into it have blocked it, masked it, done both of those things to it, so we are not able to perceive it. And the same thing actually goes in the fragrance world, where when you get a product that is unscented, it actually does have chemicals in it that are affecting your ability, that are reacting with your olfactory sensory neurons. It's just that what they're doing is, for instance, there may be something in the, let's say, the laundry detergent that if it was just plainly out there, would potentially not smell all that great. So there's another chemical that's put into that kind of blocks your ability to perceive the not so great formula that's already there. And likewise, in terms of blocking taste sensations, we can have something that's bitter and block it by introducing salt and fat and sweetness. And actually, this is something, for instance, if you are a super taster and you're likely to actually be avoiding eating those healthy leafy greens, which are in fact very good for you, one way to get over not wanting to eat them is by doing things like adding salt. Salt actually does block bitter taste. By preparing them with more fat, adding sugar to them. So if you made Brussels sprouts, for instance, with the right kind of caramelization of fat with some salt and some sweetness to it, you could block a lot of the bitterness and have a super taster go, okay, now I'll eat my Brussels sprouts. Just in the same way that we make something that's actually good for us more palatable to someone who's hypersensitive to the bitter, there may be compounds that are in certain ultra-processed foods that actually taste bitter that are blocked by and or masked by the other components to them. I don't actually know. Every ultra processed food is different in terms of the manufacturing process, so I can't say for certain that there are bitter compounds in X, Y, or Z, but just it's possible.
Where I was going with that idea is that ultra processed food, if you actually look at what it is, there's not even food in it sometimes, like it's all food product. So why are we not inherently disgusted by it? But your explanation is there may be no bitterness, or the bitterness is masked.
Correct, but it's also the case that we could psychologically tell ourselves to be disgusted by it, transforming. I'll give you some examples just in terms of the way that our brains can transform food into being something that you wouldn't want to eat. And I'm not advising this, but for instance, if let's say you were eating pea soup and very homemade, all good ingredients and so forth, and someone came up to you and said, "Ah, that looks like vomit." You might go, "Oh no, don't, why did you say that? Now I don't want to eat this pea soup." If you're, especially depending upon how susceptible you are to other people's kind of labeling. And now, but the point is that this person tried to change your interpretation of what you're eating from something that you liked into, now I've made it seem as if it's something disgusting. So one way potentially to try to alter our responses to ultra processed food is to think about the fact that they are all kinds of non-food ingredients, that they are potentially not at all healthy for us, that they are not real, and they have all kinds of qualities to them that we wouldn't want to eat if they were in isolation. If you want to take apart all the different ingredients that are in some ultra processed food, you wouldn't want to eat it by itself. And now we're putting it all together, and you're saying that you do want to eat it because in your mouth it feels good. But if psychologically you get your head around the fact that it's actually made up of pieces that you wouldn't want to actually consume, that may be helpful for getting into this sort of, I've tried to make this food become disgusting so that I can resist it. And it can be just a psychological telling yourself, and it's actually true, that what you're consuming is not at all good for you.
So in understanding disordered eating, I'm trying to pull all this together to help us understand, if it's not addiction, what is it? And then how can we change?
I really think it's psychological, and it's interpretation, and it's habit, and it's behavior that our thinking process has been short-circuited out of it, and we're just doing it. And because it feels good, for instance. And if we instead become more intentional, more thoughtful, and even manipulative of ourselves in a way, and say that the ingredient list. So one thing to do is, if you're getting some ultra processed food, read the ingredient list. And how many of those ingredients do you even recognize as being anything? Can you pronounce it? Like, what is it? And if you were to look it up and find out what it was, would you want to actually eat that? And that may be a way to help you say, okay, you know what? I don't really want to eat this food that has all these different ingredients in it that are really not necessarily helpful or in any way good. And therefore, I don't want to eat it, and it's actually gross because it has all these things in it that I wouldn't want to eat otherwise. So a kind of a way of retraining yourself, or giving yourself that pea soup looks like vomit of the ultra processed food. I do want to make a point though, that sometimes the idea of eating meats and so forth gets conflated with ultra processed foods. That vegan Impossible Burger is made out of just as many ultra processed, if maybe not more, ingredients than the meat burger that was manufactured, that may have extra ingredients in it to make it shelf stable, and et cetera, and so forth. It's not that eating meat is bad versus being a vegetarian or being a vegan. And you just have to be careful in all cases not to eat foods that have been highly adulterated, highly altered, and highly constructed. So the basic thing, I think the most important thing, and this is just common sense, is you just want to eat whole foods. I go back to the sort of the wisdom of the grandmothers. And if you can, there's also issues that are related to having the finances to do this, the time to do this. But if you can either buy or grow your own stuff, or when you go to the grocery store, buy the specific ingredients that you're going to then bring home, the actual raw, real food ingredients, and then you're going to make your chili from that rather than buying the can. That would be so much better for you, for instance. But again, this is a situation of privilege. I can afford the time to go and buy those foods and make the foods. And it's also probably going to cost more often to buy the individual ingredients than if I just buy the can. So there's an issue here which is potentially non-equitable, and this gets into something else entirely. But yeah, the idea of getting real food and just cooking with real food is the key to health.
In terms of practical interventions, one, it sounds like it's basically we're trying to undo what the food industry has done for us. Like, they've made the ritual of overeating part of celebrations. They've made it acceptable to eat throughout the whole day and to eat as much as you want. They make food so strong smelling like you walk by the bakery and you're just compelled to go in. Can we change those, make those work for us? I guess you're saying not to inspire the disgust response, but just to inspire a healthy response.
And I'm also suggesting, and this is what my book, Why You Eat What You Eat, is really all about, is telling people about all the factors that go into our experience with eating, the social, the psychological, the sensory, the neurological, the environmental, training, and so forth. And now that you know this, now take that knowledge, give yourself a second to think about things, then take control over, now I'm making a conscious choice. Now that I realize that the scent from the Cinnabon kiosk, which is not actually baking any Cinnabon, that there's no ovens in there, they're pumping out that aroma, and the aroma is highly palatable. But go, okay, I can smell that. I realize that this is enticing, but am I actually hungry? And do I really want to eat a cinnamon bun if I am hungry? And if I do eat a cinnamon bun, or if I buy a cinnamon bun, do I have to eat the whole thing right now? Can I have a few bites? Maybe I put it away, I have some more later. I don't believe that anyone should be restricting and restraining and anything like that. I totally believe that everything is fine in moderation. And you definitely want to give yourself pleasure from food. That is one of the main pleasures of existence. So if you can give yourself some pleasure from food, absolutely do it. But do it with consideration, do it with thoughtfulness, do it with an understanding of all the things that go into making you want to eat that, and then ask yourself some questions about it while you're consuming it. And if, for instance, you're eating that cinnamon bun and the first bite is amazing, okay, great. You have another bite, also really good. You're now at the third bite, and you know what? The taste is not actually as intense anymore. This is actually something physiologically that happens, that you've been tasting it now, and your taste buds are less reactive to that sweet, creamy, cinnamony sensation. Now that I'm not getting as much from it, and if I'm not really hungry and I haven't just run a marathon or whatever, you know what? I'm gonna stop eating it right now. That doesn't mean I'm not gonna throw it in the garbage, or maybe I will, but I don't have to. I can come back to it later and then get that real high from those first few bites of it, and then say that's really what I wanted. I really got that pleasure. I don't need to go further because the pleasure is actually diminishing as I go further.
If a person can't do that, which a lot of our people can't, how would you explain that? Even though they say, I'm not tasting it anymore. In fact, I feel disgusted.
I have to say, this is where my expertise does not really I can't really be helpful here. I know there are people that really do feel this loss of control, and they just become, the food is really controlling them. And why that is the case and how to break that, I do think it could be helpful to start thinking about, this is bad for me, or this is going to make me feel bad if I do this, sort of preparatory. So don't even start, because if I start, I can't stop. There may also be some behavioral strategies, like we are actually inherently lazy, which is good because we don't want to be just randomly expending energy, because we might need that energy to like help us actually survive and do something that we need. So if you have whatever it is that you are going to be triggered for and overconsume, put it somewhere out of reach. So you may have taken a bite of whatever it is. Now move it across the room, and you're sitting somewhere else, and you actually have to get up to go get it. And then if you bring it back to you, now take it and move it somewhere else where you have to get up and go there to get it. And even if you do keep on getting up to go get it, you are still giving yourself maybe a little time in between to say, do I actually want to get up and get it? Do I need to get up and get it? How am I going to feel after I've gotten up and gotten it?
What would you say with this? So we see cigarette smoking. We have plastered the diseased lung on top of the package of cigarettes. So the people look at it, have to go through that moment of, oh my God, that's disgusting. Could we do that with some of the more obviously bad ultra-processed foods? Have a picture of somebody with a diabetic foot. What do you think about?
So I don't really like that. I'm not really someone who wants to turn food into something disgusting and unpleasurable. And I actually think it's okay to have, I grew up in Montreal, And there was a certain kind of tourtière, la belle fermière tourtière, the pretty farmer's wife tourtière. It's a meat pie. Meat pies are notoriously, and this is before even ultra processed food got to be like such a big thing. Anyway, meat pies are like filled with preservatives and lard and all kinds of stuff. It tasted so good though. I remember eating it as a kid, and it would also be something my parents were going out, the babysitters staying with us. That was a sad thing. You get to have tourtière. So in any case, I don't want people to say, no way, I'm never going to eat tortilla again. Look at the diabetic foot or whatever. I want people to be able to say, you know what, I can have a little piece of tortilla. I can have a small piece of whatever that is. I don't want to have to think it's horrifying and horrible. I want to be able to get to the point where I have an understanding of myself in relation to that, and I can take the small steps to try to not lose myself in the food and not have the food control me.
We're coming to a close. I just want to say I really enjoyed both the two books. Do you want to tell us a little bit about each book? Because I think people should read them.
Thank you. Yes, so That's Disgusting is really all about the emotion of disgust. And a lot of it I've talked about how it's based in learning and context and experience. It's also a really interesting emotion because, as I said, it's all about survival. All of our emotions are there to help us stay alive in some form or another. And the very interesting relationship of disgust to fear of our own death, and the fact that actually humans are the only creatures, as far as we know, that experience the emotion of disgust. Animals will spit something else that tastes bitter. Again, that's a prevention from consuming poison. But having this sort of emotional response to feces or blood or whatever the case might be, that's a really uniquely human response. And it has to do with all the psychological signs and signals and symbols of the fact that we're mortal and that our lifespan is finite, and that these various types of things are in fact reminders of our death, and that it actually also leads to the worst forms of human behavior, denigration, and so forth. And I really think that there's a really interesting philosophy behind the emotion of disgust, as well as the sensory and the psychological and the other things we've talked about.
And why you eat what you eat.
Yeah, like I've already said, so this is a book that's really about all the features that go into our experience of food. I've been told it's also funny, so that people enjoy reading it. So I hope I was successful with respect to that. So it tells stories of different kinds of people with different sorts of experiences. All my books actually do that. I try to bring in the human sort of examples. And really what I'm hoping is it really gives people an understanding of there's so many things going on when we're confronted with food we don't realize. And even if we can just get a handle on a tiny piece of it, like the fact that if I put the chocolates on the other side of the room, I'm less likely to eat them than if they're sitting beside me at my desk while I'm working and I look down and the bowl is empty and I'm like, how did that even happen? I don't remember even eating one of them. And that's distraction. That's all kinds of other things that are going on. And I didn't get any pleasure out of eating those chocolates, and I would have gotten real pleasure out of them if I would have just been in a moment with them, sat down, savored it, and so forth. So just as one of many different kinds of examples of trying to help people with various sort of hacks and tricks and things they can do, but also really teaching people about all the things that are involved and maybe giving people the momentary ability to have that little bit of reflection and approach eating in that way. And I don't like the word mindful because it's gotten co-opted in all kinds of things, but it's really just paying attention. So paying attention to what's the experience and what's going on around me. Why am I maybe being really drawn to this? Why do I think maybe this is disgusting? And then figuring that out a little bit and then approaching the food from this sort of more knowledgeable perspective.
All right. So what's next for you?
I am trying to work on another book that has its basis in smell. It's progressing in little bits in here and there. It's been hard lately to really carve out time to work on. I'm still at the proposal phase of it. Okay. Hopefully something will be there in the not too terribly distant future.
Great. And final signature question. If you could tell a younger version of yourself something about disgust in or eating behavior, food, your relationship with food, what would it be?
I actually, when I was a teenager, did have some binge eating problems. And I think I don't really actually know how completely I got over that. I also, unfortunately, when I was first at university, lived with some women who were bulimic, and they taught me how to do it. And somehow I think because I realized how actually unhealthy it was and that I was hurting myself, making yourself vomit, that actually hurts. And realizing that all of these ideas about ideals of thinness, ideas of fitting in a certain way, that the more that I thought about all these worries that I had about food, the harder it was to get a healthy approach to it. And if I could stop thinking about food in all these sort of twisted ways, it actually made me approach food in a much healthier way. So again, like the idea of not restricting, not feeling horrible, not taking my emotions out on it. And it just changed for me. And I guess if I could say something, it would be to not worry about it and maybe just start thinking about it.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for spending this time with us. And our listeners, please read those books. They're just fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life Support Group. I'm Sweet Enough. Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals who offer one-to-one counseling and group coaching through Sweet Sobriety. Please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in today's episode, we'd appreciate you leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps grow our show and allows us to reach others who need to hear this message of recovery. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. And as Vera always says, the power is ours.